funny story about my
Okay.
nephew. So my sister and her kids and her husband all went to my family's church camp last week, and we have a grove where they hold services, and there's a
Sure.
cross kind of off on the side. And during one of the services, my nephew, who's about 5 years old, was playing with his friend and being, kind of loud. So my sister went over, to tell him to be quiet, and noticed that he and his friend were basically my nephew was pretending to
Oh no.
nail his friend to this
Oh no.
this cross that's on the side. And my sister's like, "What you doing?" And he's like, "We're playing Jesus." And my sister had to, just in the middle of, this service, try to explain quietly to my nephew that we don't crucify our friends. Your heart was in the right place, but you're a little confused.
Oh my gosh. That's hilarious.
Yeah. It was, it's totally innocent and everything.
Yeah.
But when you think about this feels wrong.
Right, and I doubt your sister ever thought she would need to explain to a child that we don't crucify our friends.
Right. Nor would she ever expect her child to have that desire.
Right. Yeah.
I don't think he understood that was not a that primarily means, not even primarily, exclusively a means of torture.
Right. Oh my gosh. So that
it's like, what are you guys playing? We're playing waterboarding. Anyway, welcome to Agreeable Disagreements. Normally this is a podcast where two friends from differing political ideologies talk about a topic in the week's politics, but this is our 10th episode, and we wanted to do something kind of special and fun.
We decided that we're going to talk about one of the other topics you're never supposed to talk about with people at gatherings. Instead of politics, we're going to talk religion.
Yes. So not to give too much away, but Camron and I have an interesting dynamic between the churches that we grew up in.
Yeah, dynamic's a good word. I don't know what else I would have said. Dynamic's a good word for it.
Right. I don't even know.
I don't want to say relationship because I don't know that it's. I don't know that it is a relationship that we have. I think you're right. Dynamic is.
I think to some extent,
word.
But it'll make sense once we get into it. But with that being said, do you want to start with the history of
sure.
your church, which our listeners know? You're a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Correct. Which, for those of you who don't know, it's more commonly recognized in the vernacular as the Mormon Church, even though never once has that been the official name of the church.
That is actually something I wanted to ask you about, because I know where that name comes from, but I don't know why that's the name that has been,
in short, it was originally a derogatory term.
Okay.
It was originally Joe Smith and the Mormons kind of a thing. And we just kind of adopted it, and it slowly just stopped being a derogatory term as the church became more and more mainstream.
Okay.
To the point where at some point the church even was straight up owning it 5-10 years ago, making I'm a Mormon ads and everything. Now they're kind of pushing away from that, more to focus, that campaign, not to get too much into all of that, was more to show that we're normal people and don't have 15 wives. But now we're trying to say, okay,
calm down, everybody. It's only 14.
I don't know that I could handle more than one. I love my wife, and that is a quote that I got from my father. And now that I am a married man, I get it.
Okay.
I don't know how they would have done it. back in the day. Anyway,
maybe don't have your wife listen to this episode.
Oh, she knows. She's heard me say that. I've said that to her face in front of friends who are also members of the church. No, but that campaign was meant to like normalize people and be like, look, we're normal people. We're not weird wackadoos like a lot of people thought we were. And now there's more of a push to focus on the fact that we are Christians. And so there's a huge push right now to use the real name of the church, which is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Right. Which that's something that's interesting that I've noticed other people, speaking in reference to your church, but also like the Catholic Church.
Yeah, that one I don't get.
People seeming to not understand that they're Christian churches.
Right. And I think I've had it attempted to be explained to me by people who think that. And
well, I think it's mostly Protestants that are like Lutheran descending Protestants that are confused and like no, they're not Christian, they're Catholic, or they're not Christian, they're Mormons, and not understanding that that's not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think the only argument that has been brought up to me to argue that members of my church aren't Christians that I think has any amount of sense, and I'm not going to say that it makes sense, but is the closest to making sense, is that, one of the beliefs that we have, which isn't like a very mainstream belief, it's not something that we focus on, but it is kind of an out there one, is that we believe that every person has godly potential, meaning that every person can become like God, and also on the flip side that God once was as man now is, kind of a thing.
Right. And correct me if I'm wrong, but don't you guys also have some and I don't know if I'm getting this entirely accurately, but
sure.
Part of your belief in the afterlife includes some kind of avenue where, just as God's domain is earth within your church, that a faithful follower of the LDS Church will also gain their own domain.
So
kind of,
you can just say the weird way that I see a lot of people say it, where everyone thinks that we're going to get our own planets.
Right. I mean, yeah, that's how I've heard other people talk about it, but I also want to, I do want to get to the actual crux of where that comes from, because I know that there is, this will make sense to our listeners in a little bit, but I have enough knowledge of your church to know that that's not totally without merit. It's just maybe not an accurate description.
I would say it's not an accurate description. A misconstruing of a true principle that isn't inaccurate. In what I mean by that is the doctrine that we have is that we have the potential to, over the course of time, perfect ourselves and become like God is. And that's all that we're ever told, right?
Okay.
But
is that like God or an equal to God?
That's a great question. There's not like an official, regularly preached stance on that, to my knowledge. I would say, I don't know about equal, because I would argue that even though everybody would be progressing at the same rate, in theory, if someone's still a mile ahead of you, they're going to stay a mile ahead of you.
Right. Well, I just meant like hierarchically, like.
Yeah, you could. I think
in
Lord
of the Rings, you have Iluvatar, but you also have the Varda, and the Varda, created certain aspects of Middle Earth, and I'm waving my nerd flag very aggressively right now, but Iluvatar was the creator of all, creation.
Sure. So I would say, I would use the analogy that as a human, you can have children, and those children will grow and become like you. They can also become parents. They can also become adults, and they may do different things, but they have the same potential that you have to do the same things and become the same stations. And I would say that I would say the belief would be the same, right? That our earthly lives are modeled after our spiritual lives. We're organized here similar to how we are organized there. And that's both in family unit as much as it is in purpose and potential. And so
Okay.
I think
so. Kind of an as so below, or as below's
so above kind of thing.
so
As
above,
so below.
kind of a
but
thing.
yeah. So I mean, you could then extrapolate that it would mean that in theory, we're all going to be gods someday, creating our own planets and worlds, and that would be awesome. That's a dream, but that's not like why we're here. That's like not what we're knocking on people's doors saying. It's more like a, hey, we believe that we are children of God, and as we are children, we have the same potential to be as He is, or to become as He is.
Right.
And there's
Okay.
millions of things that means. And we're not really, we're more focused on bringing people to Christ than we are saying, hey, you want your planet?
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that totally makes sense.
But to get back to your original question, so a little bit about the history. So in the early 1800s, there's an event, and this is the history teacher in me part talking. There's an event called the Second Great Awakening, where there's a uprise in religious fervor, especially in the United States. It was a worldwide phenomenon, but it was particularly in certain parts of the northeastern United States. And there's a lot of different splits in American religions that come from this. Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses also pop up at about the same time because of
I'm actually descended from some of the founders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Ellen White?
I believe so, yeah.
She's like the founder.
I don't know of her specifically, but the people that she was like that were in her cohort.
Okay.
Some of my ancestors are included on that on my dad's side and
okay,
which my dad is not religiously involved anymore.
Well, still, so that's some really cool family history
interaction with that, but
that's awesome. Well, anyway, so around this time, there's a lot of different religions, and especially in the Northeast, and it makes its way to a small town called Palmyra, New York. Mm-hmm. Well, it's not super small, but small-ish comparatively. And a lot of people are confused. You know, what churches should they join? What are they not? And there's a young boy who was about 14 named Joseph Smith. And he was very confused. His parents, his dad wasn't super involved in religion either. He was believing, but he didn't go to any particular church. His mom attended the Methodist church. And they both encouraged him, look, if you're confused, read the scriptures and pray. And he came across one scripture in James that said, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God. So he decided, I'm going to go ask. And we believe that he went out, prayed, and had a vision where God the Father and Jesus Christ appeared to him, told him that through him they would restore the church. And over the next couple of decades, we believe that happened. And through that, it doesn't just mean that the church was created, so much as we believe that it was the same church organization that Jesus Christ set up in his life, or at least the next evolution or step, I guess you could say, of that. And part of that
it's a continuation of the church that Jesus started and that Peter continued to carry on after Jesus's death.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we believe that the church sort of fell away, and that there's a pattern of that in history, which you can see in the Bible, where there's a falling away and then a restoration, then a falling away and then a restoration where God calls new prophets. We believe that Joseph Smith was called as a prophet, and he organized the church. He translated the Book of Mormon so that people could read it, pray about it, and kind of have proof that this man is an actual prophet, not just that he's saying things, but he's got some physical stuff that he did by the power of God. And then...
But can I offer one aside?
Sure.
He did not let anyone else see the translation.
That's not true.
Is it not?
No. So actually, the actual golden plates that he translated, he let two different sets of witnesses see, and it's written on the inside of the front cover of the Book of Mormon, where there's the testimony of the three and the 8 witnesses. You've got one?
I'm going to see if of course I have one.
All right, yeah.
Fun fact, I actually got this Book of Mormon. This is not the only Book of Mormon that I have, but I actually got this Book of Mormon from members of the LDS Church who were waiting outside of
the Book of Mormon.
The play, The Book of Mormon.
You know what? That's where my wife got her first copy of it, and then decided, you know what? Let me go talk to my friend, and then join the church.
Oh wow! Okay.
Yeah.
I will say they were totally good humored about it.
Oh yeah. If you're gonna make fun of anybody, make fun of us. We're gonna be like, ha 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 ha, that's true.
Yeah. I think it does a good job of, yes, it's irreverent, but it is a well-written play. It's funny. And I think it does a good job of not being so irreverent that it's just completely insulting.
I mean, I haven't seen it. It's not really my cup of tea, but I did have a roommate.
I definitely don't think it's your cup of tea.
But I had a roommate who, at a BYU school, would wake up to spooky Mormon hell dream every day. That was his alarm.
Oh, okay.
That's fine. So if you open up the front pages, I don't know if it's before or after the table of contents, but there should be a testimony of the 3 witnesses and a testimony of the 8 witnesses.
You appear to be correct.
Yep. And in it, they talk about how they were shown the plates, how they handled them and were given them. And some of them even talk about how they were presented them by an angel who then took them back.
That was Moroni?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Who, if you're not familiar with, he wrote the last book in the Book of Mormon, and he is the golden angel that's on top of the temples that we have. Which, fun fact, all of those angels who have a horn are pointing towards the Salt Lake.
Angels that they've captured and encased in gold.
and they're pointing towards the Salt Lake City temple.
Oh, okay. I did not know that. That's interesting.
Not every temple has them. So like Mesa, Arizona, Laie, Hawaii, not every temple has them, but the ones that do, which is the 98% plus of them,
right,
point towards Salt Lake.
Which I feel like is and not to say that this is directly influenced by it, but it's same kind of concept as facing towards Mecca.
Yeah, except I would say less doctrinal and more just fun fact.
Yeah.
There's no actual reason for it other than someone was probably just wouldn't it be a cool idea if we just made them all point towards Salt Lake City? Yeah, that sounds like a great idea, John. Let's do it. And then they did.
Okay, interesting. I did not know that.
Yeah. But in 1844, Joseph Smith was taken into Carthage jail where he was murdered. And after that was a bit of a succession crisis where Brigham Young became the next prophet of the church and established within our church what happens when the president of the church or the prophet, for us it's a synonymous term, passes on, and how that title is passed on.
And that's where the church that I grew up in comes into play. Because at this time, that division of who would lead the church that Joseph Smith the second started was between Brigham Young, who carried on the church that would, that we would later know as the Mormon Church, and the other contender in that was Joseph Smith III,
right,
who created my church, which up until and I've been trying to look this up. I think it was about the early 2000s, up until the early 2000s.
2001.
Oh, is that when?
Yeah.
Okay.
I've got all the pages pulled up because I'm a dork.
Thank you. So in 2001, we changed our name to from the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to Community of Christ in order to set ourselves apart from the LDS Church, but also I think to set ourselves apart from other oh gosh, what's the maybe you can help me with this, but
sure.
These churches that branched off from Joseph Smith II's original church, the term for it is restorationist.
So restorationist church is just going to refer to any religion that believes that it's restored and not broken off of,
right?
Branched off of, you could say. The term I would probably use is just a branch or a break off or a breakaway.
Right, but there is an umbrella term that it's either restorationist or reformationist, and there's another church that I think has gained more publicity in the past for things that now, the majority of people, I think, mistakenly attribute to the LDS Church,
Mm-hmm.
and they, I think, went by the name, like, the Reformed Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Yes. So there was the
And
Reorganized, which is what
which
you
is
were.
mine.
Then
Yes.
there was the Reformed Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and then there was the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
You know
Those
what?
are the three big ones.
I'm thinking of Fundamentalist, and that's
Probably.
like what
They're
Warren
the crazy
Jeffs was a
ones.
member
They're the
of.
ones that are like regularly getting raided by the FBI for like cultism and
Yeah,
abuse. Yeah.
yeah. Whereas your and my churches, once a year, if that.
Emphasis on the if that, please.
If that. Yeah. No. But basically, so what we're getting at is that, and why I'm excited to talk about this is that, just like in politics, Cameron and I have very differing views on religion, despite the fact that our the churches that I guess technically I am still a member of my church. I'm not super involved, but at least the churches that we grew up in have a common ancestry, and yet have diverged to be as close to polar opposites as I could imagine, while still both maintaining a
I would say while still being in the same Venn diagram.
Yeah, while still considering themselves Christian churches.
Yeah, I would say, like, you guys are probably still the closest religion to ours,
Mm-hmm.
and yet are still distinct enough that there are enough religious, theological, organizational differences that I would say we're not just the same with two different names.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm honestly surprised with how similar they still are, at least in terms of like structure and organization. But theologically and ideologically, I think in the past it's been a little bit more of a separation. But I think even still today, because I know that both of our churches within at least the last decade have kind of shifted,
Sure.
One way or another, to kind of modernize certain views and practices and stuff like that. But
Yeah.
still very much two different churches and two different, I think, ideological viewpoints. And that's why we wanted to discuss it, because this is something that Camron and I talk about all the time.
One thing I go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead. You finish.
I was just gonna say, I think that's was a big influence on how we even started to, like, how we even became friends, and how we found this habit for arguing with each other.
Yeah, I think
but
we were on a
enjoying
bus.
the arguments.
We were on like a bus for a field trip or a band trip or something, and you were like,
Oh,
I think I remember you being like you had known already that I was Mormon because I was the only one in marching band, and so everyone just called me the Mormon or just Mormon. That was like, it wasn't just like, oh yeah, go see the Mormon, he'll know what to do. It was, hey Mormon, get over here, kind of stuff.
Okay, but at least you actually are Mormon.
Right.
My nickname in high school was Greg. My name is not, my first name is not Greg.
I still have trouble not calling you Greg. I still struggle with that.
Yep. I still respond to Greg. Greg is not my middle name. It's not my first name. I had never been called Greg before. But somehow I found basically we had too many Andrews, and so somebody decided that my name was now Greg, and so for 4 years everyone knew me as Greg. And that's not just people who like knew me and knew the backstory. That was like, I would go into class the first day of school each year to teachers I had never met before, and when they're going through the roll, they would go down the names, and instead of saying Andrew, they would be like, Andrew, oh, Greg, you're right there. I'm like, how do you know that?
I remember there was one time where like the teacher said Andrew. It was the math teacher that we had together, and I think it was Mr. Carey. And he was like,
"Oh yeah,
Andrew," and I was like, "Who's Andrew? Why are you raising your hand? You're Greg."
Yeah,
I remember, and then actually having to be like, "Oh," and it wasn't like I just met you. I'd known you for like a year and a half.
Yeah.
Anyway.
No, it got so bad. It got to the point where like, so the house that I lived in when I was in high school, like my bedroom was upstairs, my parents' bedroom, like the living room, like basically everything else except for mine and my sister's bedroom was downstairs. And so like I'd be, in my room with like my music on, my door closed, typical angsty teenager. Oh, yeah. And my mom would like be yelling for me to come downstairs to like do a chore or something. And she would yell Andrew like 4 or 5 times, and eventually she just started yelling Greg because I had stopped responding to the name Andrew altogether. And like I said, to this day, if I hear somebody yell the name Greg like across the street or something, I will immediately whip around.
Well, anyway, I think I found out that you were a member of your church because we were on a bus, and I think you finally were like, oh yeah, I'm a member of this. Like, someone called me Mormon. Someone was asking me, I think it was maybe Brian, was asking me questions or something. And you were like, oh yeah, well, we're actually pretty similar. And I was like, okay. Never met someone who has said that to me before, because we're in a very Baptist community. And you were like, oh yeah, I'm this.
I guess I would say, I don't know if Springfield and Thurston, the part of Springfield that we went to high school in, I don't know if
it's
Baptist,
just a lot of the people who are around us. Because I know a lot of people went to a couple specific like Baptist churches. Maybe it's just the people who I hung around.
I definitely would say that we were in a more like evangelical Christian centered community, which I think the Baptist church, all iterations of the Baptist church definitely fit into that. But I wouldn't say that we really had like an exceptional number of like specifically Baptist classmates.
I mean, it was 12 years ago, so I'll take your word for it. So, I guess getting back to this, one thing that you mentioned was like the updates, how the churches have shifted a little bit. And I want your take on that, because your church has done way more, I think, adapting and shifting than mine has. And I still think mine has adapted and changed quite a bit.
Certainly.
But I would say for us, there's been a big push on policy changing, doctrine not, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And so we'll see a lot of things that change, and some people will be like, oh, well, why are they changing that? And it's, well, the doctrine, the principles are the same, the actual things that matter are the same, but the policy, as far as how we react in certain situations or how we handle certain situations, how we proceed, changes. And for us, that means the structure is basically the same. It means the organization is basically the same, but some of the language and some of, before it was, we just kind of let some people say things and we just kind of pretended not to hear them. Now we kind of say, no, that's not right. We're being, kind of more encouraged to stand up against some things. And it's not like direct, hey, stand up in Sunday school and go against this, so much as it is reiterating certain principles.
Clarifying.
Right. So I guess one example would be LGBTQ communities, right?
Mm-hmm.
The church, while maintaining the position that marriage is only between a man and a woman, still has, especially in recent years, come out and said, we still need to love everybody the same. we still need to invite everybody, regardless of who they are and how they identify, to come unto Christ. We
Right.
still need to treat them exactly like any other brother and sister. And there is no reason, excuse, or circumstance under which any kind of hate or disrespect or malintent is justified.
Right.
And in past years, it was just more like, oh, we got the crazy boomers who, or not even boomers, before that, it was people before the boomers who were like, oh, they say things, we don't always agree with them, we just let the old people talk. And now it's more like the leadership, like, which the president is Russell M. Nelson. He's 98 years old or thereabouts. And he's up there saying these things and saying we need to love our brothers and sisters no matter who they are, no matter what they do, no matter what they believe in. And I think that's been a big shift for us, has been standing up to the hate, even within our own communities.
So I think that's really interesting that's the one that you bring up, because I think I wish that there was another term, because how I've always kind of thought of fundamentally the difference between our two churches is that your church is more conservative, and that's not to mean conservative politically, although, you know, sometimes that definitely does.
I think demographically speaking, oh my gosh, speakingly, what am I, an English teacher?
Yeah, God. Yeah, let's hope not.
Yeah, I'm not anymore. Anyway, keep going.
Can't even spell your own name.
Yeah. Anyway, you were saying.
Anyway, and I've always thought of my church as being more progressive, and again, that's not necessarily meaning progressive politically,
right?
Just more apt to change with, I think, just kind of with the times, or just change in general.
You could say malleable and static instead, maybe.
Sure, yeah, but also, I mean, I do think that, like, politically, your church is, on average,
typically speaking, more members of the church are Republicans than anything else, but there is still a significant number who are Democrats or, like me, independent. Yeah, but no, you're right. I think you've had a fair assessment in what you've said so far.
Okay, yeah, but in terms of LGBTQIA, God, that's a mouthful. We need to come up with a better acronym. But in terms of those issues specifically, my church had very similar views until relatively recently. That was a big kind of debate in my churches, or I was about to say, as recently as 5 years ago, but honestly, it's still going on. And it's hard to explain. It might make more sense later once I kind of explain more about my church. Sure. But as of today, we have made a concerted effort to, like you said, to make sure that everybody is treated equally, that people of all, races, cultures, sexual orientations, identities feel welcome within our church. But I mean, there's still, we're still, like, as a institution, globally, I don't think that that's a homogenous viewpoint. But
I would agree with that for us. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think for any organization that spans the world, which both your and my churches have, congregations and mission centers and members who live literally all around the globe, but speaking from my own church and our specific delegation within the Pacific Northwest, we've made a very concerted effort recently to ensure that we had like we partnered up with a group called Harmony that was basically a task force to encourage LGBTQ members to feel comfortable engaging in a church community. And It wasn't an evangelical thing. It was more like, here's resources that we have if this, if spiritual thing is something that you're missing. And my church fully allows LGBTQ members to be part of the clergy, fully allows them to be married. Recently, my congregation switched from having a single like pastor as the head of our specific congregation to having a team, and one of the members currently is a gay male, and but like I said, that was not the case until relatively recently. In fact, that member of our pastor team, one of the leaders of our congregation, left the church for several years because the church did not condone his relationship with his now husband, and now both of them are highly involved in the church. And it was only after that he came back, a few years ago.
Interesting.
But it's getting back to the original point, I think it's interesting that that's the initial comparison that you made, because that's also the initial comparison that I make when, describing like, oh, how are you guys different?
Right. And I think I bring it up because, there's only so many big issues that I think would have enough understanding among listeners on all sides, where it's something that everybody can look at and say, oh, that's something I have an opinion on or know something about.
Yeah.
And that's something that is still ongoing. Yeah.
Well, so before we get into kind of how they're different now, maybe let's talk about the reasons why the church split, with one part following Brigham Young.
Sure.
And one part following Joseph Smith III. And from what I know,
well, pause for just a second. Okay. I want to hear what your understanding of it is, and then I'll tell you what my understanding of it is. And I want to see if how those two compare, because I'm sure
yeah,
what you were told growing up in the church is, maybe 5-10% different. Just because of perspective.
I think more than that.
Well,
yeah.
I would say minimum 5-10%. I guess I should say.
I definitely think it both sides are going to be a subjective account.
I 100% agree. And so I'm interested to see what the differences in that perspective are. This episode of Agreeable Disagreements brought to you surprisingly and unironically by Jesus. Or the religious movements that happened because of him, I guess. That's it. That's the entire ad. And I'm only doing one take. So, yeah. Okay, so before we jump back into it, just in the little interim that we just had there, you were saying, like, just want to double check that we're both comfortable and should feel free to kind of push back on what we're saying, which I think, again, is the purpose of the podcast, and I think it's great.
Right.
One thing I want to point out is my church, especially in the last 15 years or so, has had a huge push for transparency, where there's a lot less denying things about the past. There's a lot less trying to worm our way around things, and there's a lot more acceptance of, yeah, things were imperfect. People were sometimes bad people and made bad decisions, and owning up to a lot of that. Especially with some of their publishings, there's a project that just finished called the Joseph Smith Papers, which is essentially just a 14-volume biography of and collection of every document that we have that we can confirm is, about him, good, bad, and ugly. And I haven't had a chance to read all of it, and I don't think that I will. But some of the stuff that I have seen from it is very shockingly objective.
Yeah.
Where I was like, wow, you would think that the church would take a chance to spin it, and they don't. Or you could argue maybe they do, and I'm just thinking that they were going to spin it to 10 and they only spun it to 4, which is
right.
But
right.
I
think just from my own observation, I think I've definitely seen the ramifications of that. This is the first time that I'm hearing about that, and I'd be really interested not only to look at that, but also to find out if my church had any input into that, because
totally. We used some of the documents that you guys hold. Ours as part of there's a coordinated effort.
Yeah, and something that I just learned, and that I'm sure none of our listeners know, is that legally, at least according to the U.S. government, the continuation of the original church that Joseph Smith II started is my church and not the LDS church, which is I mean, I think on some levels makes sense, because it was my church was founded, quote unquote, by his son, but my church is much smaller than yours and much less vocal and within the public eye, and more not 100% estranged from our history, but definitely more so than the LDS church is. So it struck me as odd when I found that out like 3 months ago, that according to the government, the original church and their property essentially was inherited by the founders of my church and not your church.
So this is a complicated thing too. And because when you said that, I was like, what? The first time, because we talked about this before. And so I think what's important here is that I can't find anything that completely supports this either way, whether it's yours or mine. What I can find is that our church was legally organized, or at least legally registered by Brigham Young, which would have been after or around the same time that yours was.
Right.
And so I think, and there's also some of the issues of, proximity.
I think yours is actually before, because when Brigham Young split off and started the modern day LDS church, I think Joseph Smith III was about 13 or 14, and I don't think he really took up that mantle until a few years later when he was older.
So the church was officially organized in 1830, but there's a difference between the official organization and the legal registration or legal organization.
Right.
And I think that's kind of where the split, as far as which one is the actual as far as the legal definition goes, which one is the continued.
I'm reading here that, oh wow, all of these dates happened on April 6th. So April 6th, 1830, that's when I think the
church
original
was
church
organized,
was at least registered, and the official founding date. And then April 6th, 1860 is when the reorganization happened, which created my church. And then in April 6th of 2001, that's when my church changed their name from RLDS to Community of Christ.
Okay.
Which is 666, and that's not a great omen, but it's interesting.
I mean, I don't buy into that kind of stuff. I mean, so I think it's just because I know there's been a lot of unofficial or maybe even official legal battles, at least maybe not battles, legal questions about who owns what. And so like
Right.
you guys do own the Kirtland Temple, which was built before the churches split, for example.
Right. And I think there's a couple others, but I'm not entirely sure.
A lot of the original properties that were owned in like Nauvoo area and Kirtland area are owned by you guys still.
What about in there's one in Palmyra, right?
Probably. I don't know.
Okay.
Honestly, my wife is more knowledgeable about that than I am.
Okay.
But she also just did like a whole church history tour as a study, like semester study thing.
You told me that she went to the Kirtland Temple and
so they started all the way up in Boston and went all the way down to Independence.
Yeah.
Anywho, I think that's interesting because like I think part of the issue is that it's unclear 100% which one is legally the continuation because both have a legal claim. And I don't think we've just cared on either side enough in the last several decades to just continue the push either way.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. I'll have to ask my sister who is excuse me. I'll have to ask my sister who is a lawyer, so knowledgeable in legal matters.
Sure.
She's also an ordained member of the priesthood within my church, and she has a much better grasp of this than I do. But back to what we were originally talking about, the kind of the reasons why.
Really quick. I think I found an answer. I think part of the reason is because there are some lawsuits that, like I just Googled it, 1880 Ohio case about the Kirtland Temple, which awarded ownership to the RLDS Church, which I think is maybe some of the, it's less like a legal definition and more of like a court precedent. I guess
that's what I was about to say. Precedent. I think that the precedents would loosely
point in that direction,
point towards that.
Sure.
But I think overall the result of that is that in the eyes of the government, at least,
or at least some of the state governments at the very minimum.
Yeah.
But that's what the courts do. They interpret the laws to make those kinds of decisions. So that would make sense. Yeah.
And courts have never made a poor interpretation ever in the history of America. That was so hard for me to say with a straight face.
Oh my gosh. Breathe in, breathe out. All right. Anyway, you're saying back to...
I'm fine. So some of the differences from my understanding are... I know for a fact that one of them was the idea of women in the clergy. And for those who are not familiar, within the LDS Church, women can't be ordained. And that was one of I don't know if it was a main point, but it definitely was a point that was established at their split, that the members of the church that followed Joseph Smith III, and then created my church, that was a reason. There are other things like just doctrine and the adherence to certain beliefs, and there are things like I think there were financial disagreements, organizational disagreements. There are things like certain prohibitions, which and Camron and I were discussing this during our break. The only ones I can think of are ones that actually came about after or much later than the actual split, but just the general sense of difference in, I guess, maybe values, things like the prohibition of alcohol, which again wasn't prohibited in the LDS Church until long after this whole thing split. But if you can't tell, my church doesn't prohibit that. But since then, there have been a lot more, I think, a lot more differences, especially in terms of doctrine. But before we go into that, do you want to add on to anything or
Sure.
contradict anything I said about the separation?
This is, and I'm not saying you're wrong. This is the first time that I've heard that women in the priesthood goes back to the split, and it very well could be. I will admit, church history is not my forte. I primarily focus on like communist history as a historian. But I am still more familiar with my church's history than the average Joe Schmo. My understanding was that in 1984 was when it was official for your church that women could be ordained to the priesthood. Is that correct?
I don't know when it actually took place. I wouldn't be surprised of that, but I think it was more of the sentiment.
Okay.
And that's not to say that we really leaned into that and put our money where our mouth is. It could very well be that it wasn't until 1984 that we actually enacted that. But it was
well, there's the movement, and then there's the official action, right? I would say for us, we do have women in clergy, but it's not, I guess, the same as you would think. So like our church runs something called the Relief Society, which is one of, if not the largest exclusively women's organizations in the country, if not the world. And it is purely run by women. There is no man that has oversight over it whatsoever. And there never has been, other than they help counsel with local leadership and global leadership. So in a local community, the president of the Relief Society, again, a woman, sits on the ward, which is the name for our congregations, sits on the ward council and has just as much say as anybody else. Now, that being said, we have local, regional, and global Relief Society leadership. And again, all of those positions are held by exclusively women. You are right in saying that we do not ordain women to the priesthood, but we also don't necessarily feel like we need to. And it's not because we don't feel that women are worthy so much as we work in different capacities, right? Women, we believe, still work in the priesthood and perform priesthood ordinances. Any ordinance that is done by priesthood power and authority. And in our temples, where we do certain ordinances, the men perform ordinances for men, and the women perform the ordinances for women, and that can only be done by priesthood authority. And so it's very easy for me then to believe or to argue, and this was pointed out to me by a university professor at BYU Hawaii, who was actually the first African-American missionary from our church, and whose dad was the first African-American to be given the priesthood in the 70s. And he brought it up and said, women have the priesthood. Everybody has the priesthood because the priesthood is just the power of God that performs, and the authority of God that performs these ordinances. But men are ordained into offices of the priesthood. So there's a difference in the language there, where we don't necessarily think that anybody is given the priesthood so much as we are ordained to those offices and work within the priesthood. And even in that sense, that would mean that these Relief Society presidents and their organizations are also, if you see the priesthood simply as the power and authority of God to make change on the planet or to, administer or minister, then yeah, you could say that everybody has and works within the priesthood. but we ordain men to offices of the priesthood. And you could go into a lot of different reasons for that. Typically, I tend to think that men are a little bit less stable unless they have something to do. And so you could argue that men need that added responsibility to keep us in shape and give us another reason to stay worthy, to stay in shape, to stay focused on what we need to do. You could argue that that is a rather sexist view of men.
I mean, I do think it's sexist in the sense that it holds prejudice.
Sure.
For us, for both genders, but I don't think that it's prejudice in the way that it's necessarily malicious.
Right.
You know?
And I guess another way to put it would be
it's kind of like a separate but equal kind of sentiment.
I see what you mean there. Another way that I've heard it described, or maybe not described, heard it explained, is we hold women to such a high esteem in our church.
Mm-hmm.
And we really do. We don't often get credit for that because, we don't ordain women to the priesthood, but
right.
You listen to any church leader talk about women, and it's always they are amazing people who, have powers of creation, who have, all this divine potential and experience to help everybody in lots of different ways. And we do believe that different genders have different, maybe not responsibilities, but different inherent characteristics.
Okay.
And, typically speaking, we would say that women, again, this is a typically speaking, are more caring and more more often better at providing the emotional care and needs for a lot of family members or for friends or for people. Support. That's the word I'm looking for. Support, right. in that sense. And so in another way that we would see it is that we hold women in such a high place that ordaining men to the priesthood kind of is what would bring us up to their level, less than bring them down to ours, if that makes sense.
Right. So I hear what you're saying, and I can see that viewpoint, even if and I'll be honest, even if I wholly disagree.
That's fine.
I think that my church doesn't make that distinction.
Sure.
Doesn't make that distinction of different genders or different types of people, however you want to categorize people, that they would innately have different abilities or different roles that they could play. But I do think that there is something to be said for being aware of societal pressures and circumstances that create a dynamic that would lend themselves to those kinds of dynamics. So, for instance, personally, I don't believe that like women are inherently better homemakers.
I wouldn't
societally,
say I wouldn't say homemakers, but yeah.
Well, but that they're better at the duties in the home, but societally, and I'm not talking about our churches. I'm talking about just Western society in general.
Sure.
Societally, those have been the opportunities open to them, and they've been pressured into that role, and so from an outside observer, it could appear as though as though that fits their innate ability, even if it's, it has nothing to do with their actual like innate ability and more to do with societal pressures. And I think maybe that's where your church and my church differ. Also,
Sure.
I while you were talking, I was listening, but I was just checking myself real quick. So the specifically, and it is a little vague, but specifically, I think what I was referring to in terms of at the start, or like at the separation of our churches, the women in clergy thing was termed priesthood piety or polity.
Okay.
And it was, but you are correct that my church didn't actually allow that until 1984. So,
but I know
like
what
I
you're
was saying
talking about.
earlier,
When you use that term, I know what you're talking about now.
it was
Okay.
they had the right idea, but they didn't actually execute it.
I see. Yeah. Okay. I know what the polity movement is. So that
Yeah.
makes more sense to me now.
But let's move on to maybe some more contemporary differences.
Well, really quick, because one of the things that you brought up before the break that we never got to was the narrative of the split itself. And I do want to, because I mean, I feel like it might be a shorter discussion, so I want to snag that real quick.
Yeah, I don't think you had an opportunity to give your point of view.
Well, we didn't really hear too much of yours, other than just that it was the son. But my understanding is that the Joseph Smith Jr. or the second, whichever term you prefer, is murdered, and then there's this question of who's going to lead the church, and the 12 apostles take a couple of years to get together because some of them are spread out around the country, around the world, and it takes some time to get back together.
Can I interject real quick?
Mm-hmm.
So for those who don't know, both Camron and my church leadership is structured by there are two kind of divisions of priesthood. There is the lower division, which is the Aaronic priesthood, and then there's kind of a higher office called the Melchizedek priesthood. There are various different roles within those. Not all of them are the same between our churches, but they're more or less fairly similar.
Yeah.
But then up at the top levels, both of our churches have a council of 12 apostles, and then at the very top, the head of the church is the president, but also at least in for your church, literally viewed as a prophet.
Yeah.
For my church, it's more of a description of it's a looser description.
Sure.
I think that, and again, it's difficult to describe what my church believes because we are fundamentally a non-creedal church, which is the idea that we don't tell people what to believe. It's whatever they believe. That's a relationship between them and their religion or their connection to religion. But we do still term the president of my church as the prophet. We still adhere to the general concept of continuing revelation, which is the idea that this prophet can still commune with God and get divine inspiration. And that's what leads them to lead the church. Right. I just wanted to go over that because
and that is a very good point of clarification, because I would have just blown right over it and not thought twice. So Joseph Smith Jr. dies, and the 12 apostles gather back together, and there's sort of a little bit of a question, like, how do we go about who's the next one in charge? And while they're deciding eventually on the senior apostle, which is, kind of the pattern set forth in the New Testament, where Christ announces Peter as who was the senior apostle, as the next head of the church. And at the same time, while that's going on, there's also Emma Smith, so Joseph Smith's wife, and a few other members of the church who think it should be his son, Joseph Smith III, who was, I believe, 11 years old at the time.
Yeah. I think I said 13 or 14, but that was just an estimation. But he was
middle school age.
Definitely adolescent.
Yeah. And he officially accepted that in a 1860-ish?
1860, yeah.
Okay. Conference. Yeah. Where your church was officially organized. And that's kind of where the split happened, is a lot of our church members believed, yes, it's Brigham Young, and had, we believe, some spiritual experiences to help them gain that testimony or belief, and followed him to what is now Salt Lake City. Mm-hmm. And your church stayed in Independence, Missouri.
Yep.
And continued on there with Joseph Smith III.
Yes.
So from your perspective, did I miss anything? Is there anything different?
As far as I know, no, I think that's accurate. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it.
Cool.
But I wanted to get into, because I know we could do a two-parter on this, because I think we have a lot more to say.
We still got like another 15-20 minutes in this time.
Oh, I think we have more to talk about than that. So
we could.
Maybe after this we can discuss doing a two-parter. But I kind of wanted to get into some of the more contemporary differences, because specifically, I wanted to talk about something I already mentioned, which is the fact that my church still uses the Bible, right, both the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Book of Mormon, and what a lot of most people are. I'm assuming most people are familiar with the Bible. I think they've heard of the Book of Mormon, but there's a third book called the Doctrine and Covenants, which is more kind of the writings of the president / prophet. And the quotations that I used are for my church, not for Cameron's church.
Fill some time, because you have a copy of our Book of Mormon. We have a copy of your Doctrine and Covenants.
See, I don't have a copy of either one of our Doctrine and Covenants.
Okay, hold on one second. You fill time. I'm just whatever. Keep talking. I'll be right back.
Okay. The here's what's wrong with the Mormon Church. They steal baby tigers away from their mothers. They all voted for Kanye. They all love pineapple on pizza. They all think that Casey Anthony was innocent. They think that Johnny Depp got what he deserved, and that Amber Heard was portrayed poorly. Oh, no. Oh, hey, Cameron. I was just telling them
how babies are made?
Basic facts. No, I think if I could remember the list, I told them that the Mormon Church steals tiger cubs from their mothers. You all love pineapple on pizza.
Okay, that one is probably true.
I told them that you all think that Casey Anthony was innocent, and that Johnny Depp was the real villain in the trial against Amber Heard.
Anyway, it's still
so if that doesn't tell you what you need to know about the Mormon Church, I don't know what will.
Oh man, like I said, if you're gonna make fun of anybody, so I'm holding a copy of your Doctrine and Covenants that was
with the plastic wrap still on it. I notice.
Yeah, this isn't mine. To be fair, this isn't mine. This belongs to my wife, and she's probably keeping it in there to keep it protected.
Okay. To not let all the demons out.
No, that would to keep us protected.
Oh, okay.
I believe it was given to her by one of your guys' apostles, even.
Oh, probably.
Because she was at, like, they were doing a tour of, like, the headquarters and the grounds.
Yeah.
And she had a couple of questions. And then she was, this guy was answering her. And then she was like, oh, by the way, who are you? And he's like, oh, yeah, I'm one of the apostles here. Here, take this. And gave it to her.
Oh, interesting. I would love to, if she remembers their name or could give me a description, I would love to hear that, because I've had the opportunity to have some pretty in-depth conversations with some of our apostles.
While you're talking, I will see if I can search in our conversations and find it, but I doubt I will.
The only one whose name I can think of off the top of my head is Bunda Chipwe, and he's from Uganda, so I would assume that if that were him, that would probably ring a bell, because we don't have a whole lot of apostles that are from Uganda.
It did not come up.
Okay.
No, I don't think it was. I think it was a white guy.
Okay.
That's.
I didn't say it was white. I said it was from Uganda.
Man, I went to school. I went to college with a lot of people from Uganda.
Yeah. No, he's definitely black. He's definitely black.
Anyway,
but a very interesting person, very intelligent and compassionate individual. That's besides the point.
Yes. So you were talking about some of the differences, like you guys still use the Bible, still use the Book of Mormon, and have your own version of the Doctrine and Covenants.
Yes. Which, for those who don't know, the Doctrine and Covenants is kind of where the prophets of our church, the president, will write down what we term as their continued revelation. So, it's where they write their vision for how the church should proceed and operate. Just, their guidelines of how to live a life of service and a life as a pursuer of peace, that kind of thing. It's kind of a mix between, I guess, maybe like a constitution, but also like a guideline.
Sure.
Is there better? Do you have a better way to describe that?
I don't know, but I would say what the Doctrine and Covenants is for us is very similar in that it's a collection of revelations given through modern day prophets. For us, at least, it's particularly Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. Although there are a couple given by later prophets such as John Taylor, Lorenzo Snow, Heber J. Grant, I believe, Wilford Woodruff. There's a few, but it is like 98% Joseph Smith and Brigham Young.
Or not more or less, but virtually every single prophet president of your church adds something to the Doctrine and Covenant. Really?
Nope, not for us.
Oh, interesting. Okay,
So,
that's a difference that I did not realize, because I think the majority of ours is, and again, I wish I had a copy of it in front of me, but I think the majority of ours is revelations from church leaders since the split. Yeah. And I know that we are continually adding to it at a fairly regular pace.
So the most recent that ours was added to is 1978, which was when Spencer W. Kimball announced that the priesthood would be given to all worthy men, regardless of race, color, origin, anything.
Okay.
Which one of the things that our church is very open about that they kind of shied away from in the past was...
Except Derek.
Dude. No, so one of the things that our church is open about now, but wasn't so much about back even within my lifetime, was the fact that African men or African American men or men of African descent were prohibited from holding the priesthood until 1978. The church says that there is no good excuse for it. There's no reason for it. Historically speaking, there were some black men or African-American men or African men ordained to the priesthood under Joseph Smith.
Yeah.
The only thing that I have found, which was actually, I was at a historical conference and I was on the same panel as a guy who wrote his thesis on this and argued that in a historical context, it was the natural, maybe not the best, but the natural reaction that of the time. But essentially, my understanding is that early on in the Utah days, there was sort of a rebellion organized by a number of African men or African American men who held the priesthood. And kind of, there was like a little bit of racism there that was like, well, we need to just put a hammer down on this. And so we're going to say none of them for a while there. And that just kind of kept going for no reason until 1978. And again, the church does not say there's any excuse for it. They don't say that there's a reason why we did it. In fact, there's an interview you can see with a past president of the church, Gordon B. Hinckley, who did an interview with Larry King, and he said, we did that in the past. It was wrong. We're moving forward.
Right. Can I interject just
Sure.
Not necessarily to push back, but just maybe to get some clarification.
Sure.
So this is something that I'm familiar with. And it's been my understanding that while, yes, there is no logical reason why the church should have done that. And that's not what I'm asking about. More what I'm interested in is the reasoning or the justification that was used was related to the mark of Cain. And
that was
the Lamanites.
Used. So not Canaanites so much as it is Cain,
Lamanites.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. That's other language that has been completely dropped and
is
denounced.
it really?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, like in the 80s.
Oh, okay.
Now,
but
granted, just because they drop
the
it,
uninitiated, where the Lamanites, at least at some point within the Book of Mormon, that is the term for the indigenous people that lived in America at some point. Basically, it's part of the without going into it too much.
Just really quickly, part of the narrative of the Book of Mormon is that there's a family in Israel who is guided by God to what is now the North Central South American area, and some of those people like split up into their different families, and so there's essentially two groups: the Nephites, who are descendants of a guy named Nephi, and Lamanites, descendants of a guy named Laman. At different points, they each have turns being good and evil and whatnot. But the Lamanites typically, early on, are kind of the bad guys in the story.
Right.
And the language that is used is that they were cursed with darker skin to differentiate them from the Nephites. But that's also not unlike similar language used in the Old Testament, which doesn't
certainly
necessarily justify it. But
yeah. But there is a at least a doctrinal
precedent, I guess.
I like that word, precedent, for attributing a moral judgment on different groups of people, and that's not exclusive to the LDS Church. That's not that certainly happened within my church, within I'm sure every other church that's ever existed, and also non-religious institutions. But that basically what I was saying is the mark of Cain. That's the darker skin, essentially.
Yeah. Again, that's I'm not going to try and justify that in any way, shape, or form. That was poor language. That was racist, blatantly racist language that was unfortunately held and used by a lot of people, including high up leadership, that has since been widely denounced. And
yes, and I definitely was not trying to put you on blast.
Oh no, but it's good to clarify and helps me be like, oh hey, look, we are trying to be better.
Yes,
I think one thing that's interesting for me is that we have so many churches who think that their leadership is infallible. Right, that's a big tenet in the Catholic Church, is that the Pope is infallible. For example,
I think that's any organization.
Not ours. We are very open about having imperfect leadership. We are very open about saying our leaders do, and will continue to make mistakes.
I don't know. I think if somebody, I think if somebody doesn't have legitimate criticism and uh, an awareness of their imperfection or their organization's imperfection, or their leader's imperfection, then they're not paying attention. So
I agree.
I I will totally uh, uh, corroborate the notion that your church has changed. My church has changed for the better, I think, in both cases. But I definitely think that both organizations and especially their leadership are fallible.
Oh, yeah. I think, we hear a lot of rhetoric in our church of God is perfect, but works with imperfect tools.
Mm-hmm.
And humans do, and will continue to make mistakes. Even if we are divinely inspired, doesn't mean that we're always understanding that 100% correctly.
Right.
Sometimes even 10% correctly. Anyway, we have only a little bit of time left. Give me another one of those differences that you wanted to talk about.
The big one that I really wanted to talk about was the fact that my church is non-creedal, which I think is kind of the biggest separation.
I would agree.
And it's a difficult concept for a lot of people to kind of understand.
I still don't get it. You've explained it to me like 5 times, and I still don't get it.
And it's like, I understand it for what it means to me.
Sure.
But it's very difficult to explain that to other people.
Well, isn't that like the core of it? It's what it means to you. Just like
as of today, yes, yeah.
Okay.
So basically, what non-creedal means is that my church does not. It is 100% possible, and I can tell you for a fact that it's happened, that there are members of my church and active members and ordained members of the clergy that don't believe in the traditional existence of God.
Interesting.
Or don't believe in the idea of heaven and hell, or don't believe in divine intervention, or don't believe that Jesus was the Son of God, or even just one person, but an amalgamation of multiple people. I fall into some of those categories myself, and a lot of people, I think where the confusion comes from is their misunderstanding, at least from our perspective, the purpose of a church and religion, and that is to be of service, to be makers of peace, to help, to love thy neighbor as thyself. And I think really what it comes down to is we have attached ourselves and adopted these teachings and this narrative of the story of Jesus and the Old Testament and some of the writings of Joseph Smith II, and we've utilized those in order to create a methodology and a framework for how to basically do what I think all Christian churches call their members to do, which is to be God's hands on earth. and we're not so concerned with the specifics of what we believe and needing to have a consensus of that, as long as we are using those teachings to live a life that is advocated within these books that we have reverence for.
So
I know that that's a kind of mealy-mouthed way to say it, but
I think I get what you're saying, though. And there's a lot there that I would definitely disagree with, but I think there's even more that I would agree with. For example, I think, we definitely have a centralized, strict belief in the basic tenets, at the very least.
Right.
Of, modern day ongoing revelation, the existence of God and Jesus Christ and the Holy Ghost, the purpose and goal of them and whatnot. But I would also say that the things that we agree on is, I would say, the purpose of church. Because especially in the last few years, leading right up to COVID, there was a huge reminder and push to not be a home centered on churches. So you're not a LDS family house so much as you are a home-centered church, where the most religious upbringing, the most reinforcement of gospel principles, and service and ministering to people within and without the church happens at the home family level. And the church as an organization is there to help facilitate that and provide the community to do that on a larger scale.
Not to be the enforcer.
Correct. It's more of a, here's the general tenets, here's the guides. We're guiding you in the right direction, but how you do that is pretty much essentially up to you at home.
Right.
And granted, we still have lifestyle things that we try and adhere to maintain certain levels of worthiness. But again, it's not like someone's knocking on my door saying, "Do you got coffee in here?" Right. But at the same time, I know that if I want to live at a standard which will allow me to continue temple attendance, that means no coffee, alcohol, tobacco, drugs, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
But the main purpose of the church is ministering, is what we've really been calling it. And that's everything from making sure people within the church are taken care of, making sure people without the church are taken care of, and encouraging us to not only spread the gospel, but to primarily serve others. And one of my favorite things is every year, once or twice a year at General Conference, where we have the big meeting big broadcast of worldwide leadership. They talk about all the different
we also have, but we do it once a year.
Right. But we talk about some of the humanitarian aids and projects. And, I think to date, the church has given away more than almost $3 billion in humanitarian aid, strictly in the form of cash donations to goods, without regard of location, race, religion, anything. I know there have been mosques that were attacked by hate crimes and burned down, and we've opened our chapels to Islamic people who needed a place to quietly worship and allowed them to use our buildings for example.
I think a number of years ago, probably more than a decade, the mosque in Corvallis, I think somebody threw a Molotov cocktail into it.
Terrible.
And I remember at the time, one of the first groups that reached out to provide support was our local LDS congregation.
We love to serve, that's for sure.
I mean, I think between our two churches, that's ultimately, the highest calling.
Oh, yes, and service.
And that's the ultimate goal, is to be of service. It's just the way that we kind of define ourselves within that goal is different.
I would even say that there's still a lot of bleed over in that as far as helping people goes. But I think there's also, more to it for us as far as the strict set of beliefs go. And on that note, I had a question for you on what you said. Yes. One of the things you mentioned was that some of the clergy members that you've interacted with or know of have what you said was a non-traditional view of the existence of God. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that. That was intriguing.
So I don't necessarily want to speak for anyone.
Yeah, just a general idea, right or wrong, is fine. I'm just looking for, like, what do you mean by that?
I know.
Because, while you're thinking, I'm sorry, because you could argue that we also have a non-traditional belief on the existence of God.
I know for a fact several members of our church who are ordained both in the Aaronic priesthood and the Melchizedek priesthood, just wholly do not believe in an afterlife.
Interesting.
They think that when you die, you die.
Okay.
I know that there are some of them who, and I know I'm being cagey, but again, I don't want to.
Right, and I understand you're not trying to put words in their mouths. You're
words in their mouth, but please, listeners, trust me. These are people that I know very well.
Sure.
And I know that this is what they believe. But I also know that there are other members who, like myself, might, more term themselves as what I call a reverent agnostic.
Sure.
Rather than, which is kind of an intermediary between like a, dyed in the wool Christian and an atheist. And what a reverent agnostic is, at least what I define it to be, is I hold a lot of value for the teachings within the religion that I have chosen, because fundamentally for me, faith is a choice. So I hold a lot of value for the teachings within my own religion as well as other religions.
Okay.
And I do hold, certain teachings and texts and beliefs as sacred to myself, but I am not 100% certain of the existence of God.
Okay.
Essentially.
That's interesting. I would say that we hold, just widely speaking as a church, a similar belief, not necessarily to the existence of God, but to the value of other beliefs, if that makes sense. We're not one of those churches who says we're true and everybody else is therefore false.
Right.
So much as we think that everybody has some amount of truth and everybody has some amount of teachings that are divine and valuable, and everyone
maybe holds a little piece of the puzzle.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great way to word it. And that goes for traditional Judeo-Christian religions and any others, right? I mean, heck, I've had professors who talk a lot about, religion professors who, use Hinduism as analogies or to help reiterate tenets of our religion. And one thing that I've always loved was that we don't try to tell people, when you come to our faith or to our church, we're going to try and destroy your faith and make it ours. We say, we want you to bring what you already have, and we invite you to add to it.
Yeah.
And I think,
finish what you're saying, but then
I think that's a very different way of, we see a lot of churches, at least I've seen a lot of churches who say you're either right and us, or you're wrong.
Or you're wrong.
You're right.
And
we're like, we do believe that we have the fully true church. I'll be honest, that is a haughty claim to have, and we do maintain that. But we don't think that the fact that we have truth diminishes what anybody else believes.
It's not mutually exclusive.
Right.
Can I ask you a question? And I think that this is not just one of the biggest differences between your church and my church, but one of the biggest differences between my church and every other Christian church that I have really ever come into contact with, is the idea of of salvation and justification by faith and grace.
Sure.
Does
It's a very
the
Lutheran.
LDS Church?
Oh, dog. Sorry, my dog just knocked my microphone. Keep going.
Well, I mean, yes, justification by faith is a very Lutheran concept, but even the concept of needing salvation.
Sure.
Because for me, the story of the crucifixion and the resurrection, and I think this is probably about as close as you will get to a creedal belief within my church, and one that I think most of our members hold, is that the purpose of the crucifixion, whether or not Christ was literally the Son of God, which is another issue for an entirely different day, but whether or not that was true at all, the purpose of the crucifixion and his sacrifice was to abolish the need for that kind of sacrifice ever needing to be made again, and to allow God's love to be available to everyone unconditionally. And so for me, when people in other churches are like, oh, I became saved at this age, or I like when they talk about being saved, it feels icky to me, because in terms of my beliefs, there was salvation was never necessary. And it's great that maybe that idea led them to be a better person, or at least a person that they are more proud of. But I don't live my life and try to be a good person because I think that I'm trying to save myself or that I owe anything. It's just that I should be a good person. And how does your church feel about that, whole concept of being saved? Or
so as far as doing good things goes, I would say maybe not. I'm not going to say this is a church's perspective so much as this is what I was raised with in a household that was adamantly a member of this church. In that doing good means there's a good, better, and best in all things, right? So you're doing good because you're told to, and you're scared of what'll happen if you don't. You're doing good, that's all right. You're still doing good things. Your just motivation is not the best. Doing good because you're told to, and you don't feel either way about it. You're like, well, I do these things because I do these things. Or doing good because it is the right thing to do, right? And ultimately, that third one is what we should be searching for and trying to do. Doing good, helping others because it is the right thing to do. Now, as far as salvation goes, I will say that personally, I believe, as a member of the church and as a Christian and as my own personal beliefs, that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, that he was crucified for our sins, suffered in the Garden of Gethsemane for our sins, and because of that, we all are saved, regardless of who you are, right?
Okay.
We all have... The atonement applies to everybody.
Is that you all are saved, or that you all are afforded the opportunity to be saved?
We all are saved. We don't believe in the traditional heaven and hell. And so without getting into too much of the logistics of it, we believe that because Christ has died for all of our sins, he gets you to that bare minimum, everybody is saved,
right?
Kind of a
That's
position.
That was the sacrifice to end all sacrifices. Okay, right. So our churches agree more or less on that.
And then I would say what you do with that opportunity afforded to you by Christ is what determines sort of your outcome in this life and the next, I would say. Right? Because we believe that there's 3 different levels. I don't want to say levels because that's always a bad word. People think multi-level marketing schemes when I say that, but
I think of Dante's Inferno. That's just the opposite.
That's a much better example, except instead of hell, it's levels of heaven. where, you know, there's that bare
I
minimum.
guess that would be Dante's Paradise.
I
Which
guess
I haven't read that.
I haven't read Paradiso.
Yeah.
I've only read Inferno.
Okay.
But essentially for us, we believe that, you know, because Christ died for everybody, everybody gets brought up to that bare level. And so there's like one level where the worst people go, which, you know, is people who didn't accept the gospel, did bad things. And, you know, they
but
can
still
only
fairly good, like the level that is, like they're not suffering if
Correct.
they're on that level.
Correct. Well, the suffering for us is knowing, you know, we believe that in the next life we will either have or come to a perfect knowledge of all things. And so the suffering then is knowing that if you had just been better, you could have had more.
Right.
Right. And that's, we believe, damnation.
I've heard some people explain it as not as two separate places, but just the eternal disconnect from God.
You can make that argument, but...
And so you can exist in, you know, the same quote unquote heaven, but you won't like necessarily enjoy the full benefit of that within their belief, because you'll eternally be disconnected.
Yeah, you can make that
true
argument.
Revelation or true, you know.
I've always heard it described as separate places, but
okay,
I've also heard that as well. I would genuinely, personally, lean more into it is a separate location sort of a thing. But I've also heard it described as more of like privileges, or not privileges, I don't know, like ability, what you can and can't accomplish, kind of a thing. The bigger idea is how much you can progress. And for that first kingdom, that first level, there's only so much that your progression stops at a certain point. The second area, the second level, second ring, the Paradiso, whatever, is for good people who just refused the doctrines, who refused the gospel. And we also believe that people have the opportunity in this life and the next life to accept it. So it's people who did good things, didn't accept the gospel. And then the third level is people who did good things, did accept the gospel, and lived to that higher standard of not just doing good things because you're told to, but doing good things because it's the right thing to do.
But still with the requirement that they accept the word of the gospel.
Correct. Yes. And
so if you did, if you took a person in that caste,
sure,
and put someone else beside them who did, you know, minute by minute the exact same thing, their impact was the same, their decision making was the same. The only difference is that one person accepted the word of God and the other person didn't accept the word of God. They would be judged differently within the belief of the theology of the LDS Church.
In theory, yes. However, my counter to that would be, let's say you're in the next life, you didn't have an opportunity to hear the gospel here, or even if you did, you're still given another opportunity there. You know, you're in the next life. You have that better ability and knowledge and perspective. If you're one of those good people who are genuinely doing good things, and you have that greater open perspective, why would you say no? And the only answer to that would be, you know, habits that we create on this life go with us into the next. But for me, I would say it's less about being judged by what you don't do. And because Christ died for us, you're judged by what you do good. Right? So for me, my understanding, my belief is that the atonement of Christ wipes away our sins. And he pays all of that debt, sin debt, you could argue, or you could say, that we have. And because of that, we're not judged solely, or you could even argue at all, by the negative things, the terrible things we do, because Christ pays for that. We're judged by the good things that we do and how we try and move forward.
Okay.
If that makes sense. We try and have a very optimistic view of it.
I think that makes sense.
Another thing I would say, just to maybe explain it, is we don't think that anybody's going to be unhappy with or fighting against where they're sent or where I've often heard
that's
it
what I was asking about when I said like somebody on that lower tier, like they're not going to be suffering.
Right.
It's just they, maybe could have had a better experience.
Exactly. And
they're locked in for eternity.
We like to say there will be no claw marks on the doors or gates to heaven.
Okay.
Meaning people are going to know where they are going, why they are going there, and have an understanding and be okay with it.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
I think so. I think maybe we need to have a second episode because I think
we could do either a continuation next week or we could make this like an every 10 episodes thing.
I would be fine with either one,
or even just like a once a month, like every what we could do like once
just
a
like
month.
Brief check-in.
Yeah. Every 2 or 3 episodes.
I could be open to that, but I think it's something that we need to discuss. But I think our time has definitely run out.
Far. Yeah. I apologize because I am a loquacious, long-winded, ever-talking person.
I fully expected it to go this long, but...
Well, let's go ahead and close it out here. Do you want to have your outro that you're so adept at? Because I can never remember all the things that you say.
Yes, thank you to Halcyon Club for letting us use their song "This Life Is Tough But Fair" from their EP Headset Emotions. And again, if we're available on all the audio streaming platforms. I realized last week when I said this that if you're listening to this, you probably already know where to find the audio version.
Yeah.
But we do also have a YouTube video version that you can also check out.
Yeah. Thanks for listening. Do you have a fun fact this week?
I was thinking about it, and the only thing I could come up with is that humans have a second set of DNA within their mitochondria that's only passed down through their matrilineal lineage. So you can literally trace your mom's heritage back to the beginning of existence. Wow. But if you have another one that's more interesting.
Nope. I am.
All right. Well, then I guess we'll end on that.
You just blew my mind.
Did you not know that?
I forgot. I remember learning about that in high school.
Mr. McElroy would be so disappointed in you.
I'm disappointed in me.
Do you want to hear a joke that can I actually end on a joke that Mr. McElroy told me?
End on the joke.
How do you make a hormone?
I know this joke. Just say the say the punchline.
Let's end it right there.